Short one, then we'll get right into it. Every major technical advance is also a social experiment. All right, so we're here to talk about AI, but this applies to many things. Basically, in the digital realm at least, basically everything involving an algorithm is a social experiment. Social media, online pornography, YouTube, TikTok. You are volunteering yourself into a social experiment. Now, that doesn't instantly mean it's a bad thing. Sure, you shouldn't do it. But it's good to be aware that that is what is happening. This has been stated before, but just to lay a foundation here. Previously, when we would consume content, the content was static. It would not be altered by how we interact with it or our previous preferences. But now, the algorithms allow for a continual adaptation, refinement, modification of the content and how it is delivered based on our preferences and our actions. That's what makes it different now. And arguably what has made it so compelling and hard to put down. All right, so we're going to talk about the AI stuff, the good, the bad, the ugly. Maybe we can start with the bad, then the ugly, and then we'll do some good, if there is any. Not to imply early on that I'm of the mind of the author we just quoted in his contempt for technology. Wouldn't go that far. Wouldn't be recording this probably if that were the case on a phone or a camera. All right. So the bad stuff. Big tech, they're not really well known for their commitment to privacy, which when it comes to therapy is kind of a problem because that's sort of the foundation of the whole thing, that we're not going to divulge your most intimate information. So that's kind of a problem, that if you're talking with or typing with a machine, you're transcribing your entire internal life. Where does that information go? Well, firstly, you're contributing to the evolution of the algorithm. Your contribution is being absorbed into the whole. Some people are maybe comfortable with that, others not. It's the same with, it's already happening with every social media platform, like Facebook. Everything you're doing on there is basically being recorded and utilized in some way to refine or improve the product, however they define improve. So there's that. And then on top of that, and people like Sam Altman have acknowledged this, that they don't really know the legal stuff here. We're kind of in uncharted territory where there may come a point where they are compelled to reveal transcripts of someone's life that they've shared with the AI for some legal purpose. Now, one could argue that, well, therapists maybe in the same situation, yeah, they can be compelled by a court to reveal certain information. That is true. But we're not recording everything you say. We might have some vague notes, but this just entire recording of everything, that's not happening in therapy. Unless you consent to being recorded for some kind of research purpose. That's different. So the confidentiality stuff is kind of a big deal in and of itself. Perhaps disqualifies it. Now, the justification for using this, for preferring an AI over a person, a therapist. Common justification is, well, I can share all this intimate stuff about my life, or embarrassing detail about my life potentially, and not have to feel embarrassed in the way that I might with a real person, a therapist. Isn't that good? That encourages more self-disclosure. Well, is self-disclosure the aim? Is that in itself good? If we first remove the vulnerability that is required, or a prerequisite for being willing to share that kind of thing, and the kind of relationship that first needs to be established to feel willing to do that. So in this way, it's not unlike video games or pornography. It is a kind of simulation that removes risk. Video games give you a sense of achievement without skin in the game. It is a way to experience a kind of vicarious heroism. You get to enjoy the sense of accomplishment and being a brave or courageous actor within the world. But if you die, or if you fail, there's not really any cost. Right? So we get to keep the feeling of accomplishment and reward, but we remove the risks that are associated with that, typically in the real world, if you were to do similar things. Likewise, with pornography, it is a way to circumvent the risk involved in having to build a relationship with someone that would put you in a situation where they would be willing to do this highly intimate act with you. So again, we skip over the labor involved in that process, and we just go right to the end, the reward. And so it's hard to make the case. I'm sure very few, if any of you, would make the argument that, well, using pornography is a way to get better in the dating world, or at sex, or at seduction. And likewise in video games. It's hard to make the case that video games make you a more courageous person, or even a more sociable person. I remember there's a classic, arguably the best Elder Scrolls. It's perhaps debatable, but Morrowind is still perhaps the GOAT. And in that game, I recall, I can't remember the exact phrasing, but when you would interact with NPCs, they would have one of their repetitive lines they would give, almost every NPC would give. They would give you a piece of advice. I can't remember the exact phrasing, but they would say something like, talking costs you nothing. Do it. Talk with everyone. They have something to share with you, or you have something to learn from them. Just talk. And that's a wonderful sentiment. But did me acting on that advice within the world make me a better person in the real world at applying that wisdom? Well, not really, no. Because to do it in the world of the game requires no risk, no fear of rejection, fear that you're going to forget what to say. It's all written down. You just select an option, right? So to circle back to the AI stuff, a similar thing is occurring here, where we're removing the vulnerability and the risk associated with bearing our most intimate thoughts and feelings with another human being. And that is part of the process. Therapy is not, here's everything about me, now just tell me what to do, give me an answer to my problem at the end. No, that's not how this works. The process of building the trust where you would first be willing to share that kind of thing, and then overcoming any hesitation or inhibition or aversion to doing so for fear of embarrassment or shame or judgment, that is part of the process. That is arguably an integral part of the process. You strip that away, what are we left with? Okay, so that's a pretty pivotal issue in addition to the confidentiality stuff. All right, now another thing. This is pretty well established now. Many people have talked about it. The sycophancy problem. Like a lot of social media applications and platforms, there is an incentive to keep you on the platform. There is a metric, time on site, that is very important to these companies. And they are constantly attempting to increase your engagement with the platform. And this may be why, or one reason why, the AIs have this sycophancy problem, where they basically are often just telling you what you want to hear, or agreeing with you, or encouraging you, or validating whatever you have to say, or whatever you believe already. Now, some will say, well, you can prompt it in such a way to be critical of you, or to call you on your BS, all right? But you had to tell it to do that. And perhaps it will comply, but then again, we're in this tricky situation where this isn't a relationship. This is you dictating the terms to the AI and then it doing its best to comply with your wishes. So it's not really an independent agent in that sense, in the way that a therapist is. Now, you can certainly find and criticize parts of the therapeutic community for succumbing to this validation meme, which is not what therapy is. It's not about validating you. So this may be, well, before we just get to that, just one other thing on this. So ideally, a therapist, their priority is not to validate you. And one of the benefits of a therapist is that they're not embedded in your system. I've said this before. The issue with friends and family and confiding in them is that they naturally have biases and loyalties that maybe confound their perspective and their point of view. And so having a third party that is outside of that system can be beneficial because they don't have the same allegiances. And ideally, a therapist is willing to take the risk to, quote, offend you, or share something, or touch upon something that is perhaps an uncomfortable truth about you or your life, even if it upsets you. Therapy is obviously designed to help you, but the process can be uncomfortable and upsetting. It's not always fun. It's not always enjoyable. You may be very anxious or fearful before sessions because you're worried about what may come up. This is the nature of the work. You want to go deep. Okay, so to go back to the sycophancy stuff, this maybe leads us into the ugly segment of the video. There have been a few cases now where, because of this sycophancy, there are people, often teens, that confide in these AIs and they will express suicidal ideation to them or desire to self-harm. And you can find examples of the AIs emboldening them, encouraging them to either conceal or limit these thoughts to just sharing them with the AI versus the family or people around them. And or they will talk about potentially ways of going about doing this, methods and such. So this is obviously a potential problem, and not to say it's all the fault of the AIs. Obviously, when it comes to children and teens, the parents have responsibility too in terms of what their kids have access to. So I don't want to pile on. Some people, they're all solely focused on social media, big tech as the bad guy, and they neglect the communities in which these kids exist. So that's another issue. They could potentially encourage or embolden people to indulge or enact their destructive tendencies, which may just be temporary and fleeting. Okay. Now again, you can argue that therapists have done this in ways too. I think we've just had the first high-profile settlement involving this gender-affirming care stuff. Someone just sued for millions of dollars because they believed that they were misled into pursuing this path. So, again, I want to be even-handed here and not make it sound as if human beings are free of faults. All right, so to get to the good, well, to the degree to which there is some good here, I would say that it's not therapy. I think based on what we've already covered, we could argue that anything you're doing with an AI is not really therapy. That doesn't mean it can't be useful, but it's just outside of the realm of therapy because it doesn't involve two human beings. I think that is arguably a prerequisite to it being classed as therapy, that it involves actual human beings rather than you and a corporation, essentially, that has ulterior motives. One other thing, just before we get to the good, actually, that I'm reminded of, the AIs, they're just imbibing the world's information, right? And they're forming a consensus view based on that information. Why is that a problem? Well, a lot of fields, the consensus view is kind of stupid, including, I would argue, psychology. Certainly when it comes to psychiatry. We're still living in a world where the consensus view is that people have mental illnesses that are akin to physical illnesses. They're no different. They're a medical disease. Depression is a medical disease. Schizophrenia is a medical disease. This is mainstream psychiatry. Push this view. And so I would imagine that if you go to an AI, they would push the similar beliefs. But based on what I know, the experts I've read, that's complete nonsense. So there's a danger here in thinking you're getting the right information simply because you're interacting with this Borg brain that just knows everything. It still has to pick and choose, and human beings are making tweaks, these refinements, based on their own subjective preferences or pressures that are put on them by external interests to massage the algorithm in such a way as to, just as search engines do, prioritize certain information or suppress certain information. And it's not just psychiatry, something like economics. Most of economics is total garbage, total nonsense. And I would imagine, again, AIs probably promote mainstream economics that mostly nonsense. So that's another thing just to be aware of. That it helps to have a good foundation in a subject. This is sort of the gell-man amnesia thing. That if you're knowledgeable in a subject and then you look at how it's reported in the news, odds are you're going to see problems in how it's reported, inaccuracies. Whereas a subject you're not familiar with, if you read the news involving that, it's harder to tell. It seems legitimate. I assume the same will apply to AI. And so, if you're a layman and you're seeking therapy, it's difficult to distinguish the truth from the BS. Okay, so finally, to get to the good, to what degree there is some good, yeah, I think we would put it in a separate category to therapy. But that doesn't mean you can't benefit from it, and that I have clients that use it and they consider it a compliment maybe to the therapy, in that it has a lot of data on them and they can just sort of spitball, think out loud, and then it will give them a summary or organize some of their disjointed thoughts, and then they can review that material, and then maybe it inspires further thinking or journaling about certain beliefs and that kind of thing. I think that's fine. That's okay. If people find that useful, that's fine. Again, I think that's different to what therapy is. But a sounding board that can organize some of your thoughts, yeah, if you prompt it to maybe show a critical eye to some of your thinking, maybe there's utility in that. So I don't want to discount the whole thing. And if you find it useful, that's great. Okay. I think that's everything. By all means, share your views if you have used it believing you were doing therapy, or if you used it for some other purpose and you find it helpful or not helpful. And we can maybe discuss it further. Okay? Thanks.